right. Thank y'all for joining us. My name's Trevor Williams. I'm here at the Constellation's 5th District Studio here in downtown Atlanta on Auburn Avenue, at where we host the Global Atlanta offices. We are here for the 3rd edition of this year's Authors Amplified series. If you haven't been following this is a series that we've been conducting in partnership with the Atlanta Global Studies Center to amplify voices here in Georgia that are focused on international business, international affairs. This series started last year, in which we had 12 different in-person/virtual events. This year we switched it to a format in which we're focusing mostly on the virtual and having the sessions recorded for podcast use and posterity's sake. So today I'm very excited to have Dr. John McIntyre here, who's the founding director of the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business's Center for International Business Education and Research, or CIBER. If you don't know about CIBERs, they're federally funded programs, 16, I think, in the country.
16.
Yeah. And they focus on the teaching of international business throughout the United States and research, of course, and helping improve that, basically, and help improve the competitiveness of U.S. companies as well. So we're here today to talk about Dr. McIntyre's book, which he's edited, The Role of Multinational Enterprises in Supporting the United Nations SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals. I've got a golden copy right here. I'm very excited. This is a very scholarly publication. They priced it as such.
Yes,
so
I'm afraid so.
We're not in the mass market, but we're very excited to have John here. And I'm tell you a little bit about John before we get going in earnest. He's got a courtesy appointment in international relations at Georgia Tech's Sam Nunn School for International Affairs. Received his graduate education at Northeastern University and completed his PhD at the University of Georgia, which I was very interested to hear about.
Your alma mater.
That's right, my alma mater. So we've talked about that a little bit.
And also a little bit of time at McGill up in Montreal.
In Montreal,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And before joining Georgia Tech, he was a research associate, and this was in 1981, we should say, that he joined Georgia Tech. He was research associate for international management at the Dean Rusk Center for International Law at the University of Georgia Law School. Has published widely, authored and co-authored many books, has many professional memberships. You can read all this in the longer bio on our website. I didn't know that you're an expert in the primary aluminum industry.
Yeah, I was a consultant in that area for maybe 20 years.
And that's become a hot topic of late in international business with all the tariffs and
that is
national
true.
security,
Absolutely.
et cetera. So I'm be coming back to you the next time I'm writing a story about
Don't test my knowledge
about Quebec aluminum or something.
Yeah.
So he's fluent in French, Italian, and Spanish, and the French makes a lot of sense because he grew up in France, and we've been talking a little bit about that and his background as well. But we're here today to talk about multinational enterprises and the challenge of sustainable development. So I guess first of all, we should start with thinking about how you kind of got into this topic in general in the first place.
Well, we were kind of, I guess, early in the game.
Mm-hmm.
In the early 2000s, of course, Georgia Tech has always had the interest relating to climate evolution, to the environment, the role of engineering in making creating a better world. But for us, at the center, we partnered very early on in our evolution with the University of Lorraine in eastern France, where Georgia Tech has a campus, by the way, in the city of
now
Metz.
known as Georgia Tech Europe.
Now known as Georgia Tech Europe. But it wasn't really for that, although it was a welcome kind of coincidence. We partnered with the University of Lorraine, otherwise known as the University of the East in France, particularly their Graduate School of Business, their doctoral consortium, which brings together the various doctoral programs in various disciplines. And we created a consortium called MESD. It sounds like a disease, actually, but it stands for Multinational Enterprise and Sustainable Development. And as we evolved, we formalized that structure. We became incorporated as a not-for-profit in France and started really holding research seminars jointly between Georgia Tech and the University of Lorraine, and in particular an infrequent but landmark kind of event, which is called the MESD research conference. We are now on number 7. The next one will be held at the University of Delhi in India, November 28th through November 30th of this year, in partnership with the School of Economics at the University of Delhi, focused on about 8 questions, and I'm not going to bore your audience about the 8 research tracks that will be addressed in that conference. We have started advertising, so I think interested parties will see more on the web.
Well, I'm curious, did you just find that there were so many researchers focused on this topic, it hadn't really found each other yet?
Very, very few in the early stages.
What do you call early?
For us, it was the late 90s, early 2000. And of course, we were aware of what was going on in United Nations Circle, the Rio de Janeiro conference, the millennial goals, which of course do not exist anymore, and they were really followed by the creation of the UN SDGs by a United Nations General Assembly resolution, September 25th, 2015. But it was the culmination of many years of effort looking at the evolution of the environment. Some go back in some ways to the Club of Rome in the 1970s, which was a very controversial original study, which predicted dire outcome for the world with excessive consumption, waste. Fortunately for us, not much of that has occurred, but it appears that in terms of projection and forecast, maybe they were off by 50 years, who knows. But at any rate, there was quite a bit of research ongoing in the private sector, in associations, and the UN was making progress in really pulling the alarm cord on issues of climate, on issues of global warming. It wasn't called that at the time. Of course, Georgia Tech is well known in the area. You do know we have a school of Earth and Atmospheric Science, which had done a lot of research which does a lot of research in the area. So for us, we sort of picked up on that momentum, and we decided to ally ourselves with a French-based university, which in my case was a natural, of course, but it was also a natural because Georgia Tech had a physical facility, a research and teaching facility in Metz, which is in the region of Lorraine, right on practically on the German border. So in a sense, we had an observation platform of what was going on in Europe, the major countries of Europe in terms of climate-related issues and other issues relating to making the world a better place at the national level, if you wish.
Yes.
So, and then as we started doing research, as we published our first book in, I think it was 2012, 2013, we had a series of 5, and the one we're talking about today is number 5, actually. So it's really a series of dedicated book. We realized there were gaps to be filled. At the same time, Georgia Tech was growing, and I did a little bit of research this morning before coming to your studio, and I was able to identify 24 centers or institutes which in one way or another at Georgia Tech address issues relating to, if you wish to put it this way, the UN SDGs. And I note in particular, so what I'm saying is that the land is fertile. The environment itself at Georgia Tech is really, there's a lot of expertise, a lot of knowledge. Of course, at the Cyber Center, we were interested in the international business-related dimension. What is the impact in terms of business, opportunities, constraints, risks, and so on. But if you look at Georgia Tech, just to give you one example, we have the Brooks Byers Institute for Sustainable Systems, which is engineering-oriented, which has done a lot of work all over the world, really. We have the Ray Anderson Center for Business Sustainability in my own school, which is the Scheller College of Business. And then we have the Serve, Learn, and Sustain initiative, which really brings all of the undergrad student body through projects, looking in particular at UN SDGs at the local, at the community level, at the regional level, at the national, and sometimes at the international level. And then I will spare you the long list of 22 centers, but another one is the Renewable Byproduct Institute. And then, of course, our Strategic Energy Institute, which has a broad set of goals. One of them, of course, is looking at the implications of the production of energy in terms of creating sustainable environments. So the environment was fertile. It was a logical thing to do to add the international business dimension to this set of research ongoing in so many places, in so many colleges, in so many schools at Georgia Tech.
Well, I'll add one to your list. The Atlanta Global Studies Center is
The Atlanta
sponsoring this
Global
podcast,
Studies
and
Center, which is a joint center between Georgia Tech
Yes.
and Georgia State.
And
It's an NCR, a National Resource Center, focused on culture, language, and policy issues.
But they have a very strong focus on the Sustainable Development Goals,
do
and
indeed.
really focused
They do
on that
indeed.
at their recent
Yeah.
symposium, which we
Yeah.
were lucky enough to moderate the last discussion, Authors Amplified discussion at. So, well, how do you define a multinational enterprise for the purposes of this research, and how does that dovetail or differ from how you think of a global corporation or an international corporation? Like, I would assume that y'all have come up with a good definition for this.
Oh yes, it's a classic in international business education. Of course, the classic definition is that of the late John Dunning, which is one of the founding fathers of the field of international business studies. It's really a corporation that at least has 25% of its revenues derived from international activities outside of its home base, but is present in many, well, we shan't say how many, but more than 2 or 3 countries.
Okay.
In other words, merely exporting or importing does not make you a multinational company.
Right.
So there is a size effect. There is a mindset effect to be a global company defined as a multinational company. I would say, strictly speaking, in terms of the UN definition of a transnational corporation, there are probably 70,000, 65 to 70,000. Now, bear in mind that in the world we have about 333 million companies or corporate entities. So it's a very small percentage. Right. The U.S. has the largest number, and of course Asia is becoming a center in terms of the creation of what we would call multinational corporations. Even Chinese state-owned enterprises are increasingly multinational enterprises. It's a different model, of course, needless to say.
Well, tell us, I mean, given that it's such a small percentage, I would imagine that its effect is outsized. So tell us why the UN particularly wants to focus on multinational enterprises.
They are the largest actors. They are often, they have the resources. They have the interest in terms of really doing good, doing well, and doing good in terms of their performance. So in terms of really deploying various aspects of the UN SDGs, which we have not defined, they are probably the most adept company structures to do that in several countries at the same time.
I would imagine that this bird's eye view that they have into different jurisdictions makes it interesting for them.
They're particularly important in the United States. When you will recall, under the Trump administration, the United States pulled out of the Paris Pact, and then President Trump made a speech at the United Nations in which he expressed some doubts about multilateralism and pulled out of the Paris Pact, the 2015 Paris Pact, you may recall. So a lot of the work, if you wish, or the momentum was picked up by local communities, cities, counties, in terms of corporate social responsibilities, in terms of the UN SDGs, and also by corporations. Not all corporations, not all multinationals are ready to undertake the tasks. And there is some controversy in the US and elsewhere about the proper scope of activities of a company, be it multinational or be it local. I should tell you that in our own evolution as a center and of the MESD Association, we are gradually expanding our definition and including medium-sized companies that are not, strictly speaking, multinational structures. Because obviously they are involved too.
They're still
by
acting
definition.
internationally.
So originally we focused on multinational. They were the biggest actors with the most resources. They could finance projects. They could deploy in different countries at the same time. They had the ability to really do internal programs. They could engage in a range of training functions that smaller size companies really clearly could not, that were more focused on their bottom line as they were on the launching pad to growing their original company idea.
Well, define for us, if you will, I mean, a little bit more about the Sustainable Development Goals, because you're right, we haven't really talked too much about it. I don't want to go into
Yeah.
all 17 and the breadth of everything,
So
but just in
it
general,
is
and what kind of
okay.
buy-in do these companies have into it when, this is a United Nations
Yeah.
non-binding sort of goal versus a legislated or regulated
So I think it's important to
obligation?
say it's a product of the United Nations General Assembly resolution, which is at the that resolution had about 96 paragraphs. And when I say paragraph, I mean several pages each. And it set out the structure. But the UN SDGs didn't come out of nowhere. They were a process of evolution out of the 90s, out of the millennial goals, which are not
Yeah.
in place anymore. And many years of negotiations. You will recall that the famous Paris Pact of 2015 really revolved around climate in particular, which was the principal concern, but also about other goals. So the UN SDGs are, in a way, in many ways, they are aspirational. Some of them are more are easier to tackle for corporations. Others are a bridge too far. And I will sort of give you some examples, perhaps, if I may.
Sure.
Goal number one, which is no poverty or end poverty in all its forms. Clearly, there's a lot companies can do, but there is basically at what point does a company stop being involved in initiatives relating to reducing poverties? But if you look at quality employment, if you look at equal opportunities, contributing to human capital, to eradicate poverty, there is a lot that multinationals can do. But I would say goal number one has a fairly relatively limited scope, but some companies are pursuing it. Goal number 7 is one in which multinationals and other companies can do a lot. That is the affordable and clean energy goal, to ensure affordable and clean energy to a range of users and consumers. And so what is the role of M&E, particularly in the fossil fuel area and the energy-related field, and green technologies? So we've seen a lot of the work relating to the SDGs focusing on renewable and green technologies and reducing the carbon footprint. That's usually what people hear about and focus on. But you have to understand that the 17 goals are much broader than issues of climate. And then number 8, and perhaps we will stop there, otherwise we'll take up the time allotted, but decent work and economic growth. So that can be understood as the role of M&Es and other companies in terms of inclusive business models for employment purposes. And then there is another goal among the 17s that is salient, but I'm going to move forward in spite of my not wanting to, but it's responsible consumption and production, which is really, I would say, at the heart of particularly manufacturing MNCs. Now, you have to understand that manufacturing multinationals in the U.S. represent 3/4 of employment in the United States, if you look very closely, because the U.S. is the largest number of multinational corporations. Hence, the importance, particularly in the United States, of multinational corporations, bearing in mind that the national government really has not done as much as it could in terms of the implementation of the UN SDGs. In fact, coming up in July, allow me to mention it, we have the annual high-level political forum, HLPF, one of these acronyms that the UN produces. But it's an annual meeting which lasts about 2 weeks, in which 40 countries out of the 193 countries that's ratified the UN, that signed the UN SDGs, in which 40 countries this year at the United Nations in New York will be presenting what they call their voluntary national reviews. They will assess where they are in terms of target implementations of each of the 17 goals. Bridge too far for many of them. The United States has never, for whatever reasons, which are complex, never participated in a voluntary national review. So it's probably a good idea to mention it in passing, that somebody should suggest to the Department of State that it should be more involved in that process. And perhaps, if not a voluntary national review at the national governmental level, there should be a venue, a side forum at the HLPF for U.S. multinational companies explaining what they are doing, because it's quite remarkable what some of these US-based multinationals are doing globally.
Mm-hmm.
So it deserves attention, but it's not receiving it
Yeah.
at that forum that's coming up.
Yeah. I think that's interesting because it brings up the point that, again, these are voluntary and some countries may not want to participate.
That's right.
Based on the idea that they may be harming their own competitiveness, right?
To a large extent.
Yeah, and I think that's...
Or they're not doing enough.
Yeah, and I think that's showing up in the controversy that you mentioned over things like environmental social governance or ESG goals that are some are trying to legislate to the pushback of some Republicans, particularly when it comes to investing, say, in fossil fuel companies and banking regulations governing those things. So how do you see the interplay between the SDGs, this kind of ESG idea, and the old idea, I guess, at this point, of corporate social responsibility or CSR? I mean, where do the levers lie? Like, where when you're talking about from a government perspective?
It's a very interesting question, and it's and some would say it's a tricky question. Okay, so you've got three concepts here. You've got corporate social responsibility. Graduates of business schools are quite familiar with it, CSR, which really has roots in the 80s, 90s, where it really picked up momentum. And it's a broader spectrum kind of notion. It's almost a philosophy, and a lot of companies pay heed to it, and it's in their annual report, their 10K or other forms of reporting. And then you have the ESG. What is the origin of the ESGs? I've seen various historical attempts at justifying it. Some I've heard one said, oh, it's Quakers and Shakers, which were the first in the 18th century to introduce that notion. Be it as it may, most people agree that it's the Brundtland Report, Norwegian kind of inspired, and United Nations again. It's the Brundtland Report that gave rise to the ESG. Now, the ESG, in comparison to the CSR, the ESGs are much more quantifiable. So you have had over the years the evolution of a sideline industry, which is the provision of metrics to assess where companies are ranking, are performing in terms of implementing the ESG. There is no common consensus. There is no single uniform framework for the ESG. Different companies, which is logical in terms of industry sectors, choose different forms of ESG. But in general, I would say 70 to 80% of companies use some form of ESG metrics, and it will pop up in the report. There has been an attempt by the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, the US SEC, to impose some mandatory transparency rules that are now under review by the U.S. House Financial Services Committee, where it's considered that, and this is get to addressing your question, that implementing the ESG more forcefully within the U.S. domestic system is a Trojan horse to sort of lead to a back door introduction of the UN SDGs. And there is a lot of controversy, particularly in the House of Representatives at this point in time. And I think if you're interested in that, you should watch what the U.S. House of Representatives Financial Services Committee is doing. I believe it's currently headed by a representative from the state of North Carolina, Patrick Henry, I think. I forget which district.
Okay. Interesting. And leaving aside the regulatory aspects, because that's always fluctuating, it's a minefield for companies to try to project their values, whatever that might be, particularly when you have thousands of employees. How do you come up with a set of values, stick to them, and deploy them across many jurisdictions with many different types of laws and many different cultures?
Great question.
And I wondered if that was addressed in the book.
No.
And how companies can do that.
That's in fact, that's a shortcoming of that book. But I got to tell you that a number of us will be doing a PWD. If you're in the field of business management, that's a paper in progress.
Okay.
We will be doing one of those at the Academy of Management meeting in Boston in early August. And participating in that will be the University of Trinity College in Dublin, Basel University in Switzerland, Georgia Tech, and a number of others.
Yeah.
We're going to look at the issue of what is the role of employees, workers, at whatever level, in the buying into the UN SDGs, or the ESG, if you want to really give it a US slant-specific approach. And what can they do within the firm? What is the nature of their involvement? Is it a bottom-up or a top-down kind of thing? It's clear that particularly the young generation of employees want more. They like, of course, a good package when they get out of college. They like bonuses, particularly business students. I don't have to tell you that, that's obvious. But that's not enough for the current generation. They are often looking at what company they're going to be working for, what image it has, what reputation it has, and how they are going to really expand their horizon and contribute to the notion of stakeholder capitalism. It's really more than just the shareholder, which of course is important. Nobody would deny that. There is no company without meeting the goals of shareholders, but really going beyond that and making a contribution to planet, making a contribution to really the community and its well-being, and also preserving the planet, very bluntly speaking.
Yeah. Has the MES research found that there's a correlation between the participation in the UN SDGs and the type of governance structure that you have in the country, right? Is it more likely that democracies will participate or promote the UN SDGs? I'm particularly thinking about Japan, because it seems that you can't turn a corner in Japan without seeing one of the UN SDG pins on someone's suit, or see in the big business associations a very strong focus on this. Yet we don't hear about it as much in the U.S. I would imagine that certain authoritarian countries have their own ideas about it.
Well, the Japanese have a way of introducing change within their companies, and they also have another way, which is that of the long vision.
Yes.
As opposed to the typical European or American firm, which has sort of a quarter focus, quarterly results focus, or a medium-term strategic plan, maybe in the range of 3 to 5 years. Historically, in terms of the Japanese enterprise, what you have is these long-term visions. And the word vision has to be used with care in the English language. It's not that all of a sudden the founder is having a vision and looks in the sky, but it's really, and so the UN SDGs in many ways speak to that particular corporate approach of leadership. Now, in addition to that, in the case of Japan, you have to understand that the Japanese have a way of decision-making which sort of riles up support from the bottom up. So what might happen in the Japanese companies, and some of my colleagues at Georgia Tech are expert in that area, is that the original idea is launched from the top down. It is discussed in all levels of the company, and various levels sort of give their imprimatur, which is in the form of a seal. That's an image. And then it goes back up.
Right.
And so you have a top-down and bottom-up. Now, your question is broader than that. It has to do with not only the governance of corporate structure, but it also has to do with the democratic nature of the countries in which these corporations are located. And underlying your question, I think, is can a non-democratic form of government or state practice and take the UN SDGs seriously? And if you look at China, at least on the goal of ending poverty, you have to agree that China has done a remarkable job. Now, you could be critical and say at what cost, going back to the late 1940s, and looking at the Long March, the Cultural Revolution, all the incredible sacrifices and loss of human life that were incurred in imposing a regime. But it is a fact that the Chinese government, the PRC, People's Republic of China, has taken to the UN SDGs with some relish, because they feel they can impose it.
Now, that was actually another question I had. Like, in some cases, if you have adoption from the top in an authoritarian state, you might actually
it's paradoxical.
you might actually have quicker adoption than.
But if you look at goal number 16,
you
which
could-
is really far fetched, but I mean goal number 16 is peace and justice and strong
Right.
governance institutions, not for the company but for
Yes.
government. So
Yeah.
I don't think China would do so well, although they look at it and they have given it a different meaning. So what is how do state-owned enterprises, SOEs, in
Yeah.
China, how do they do in terms of implementing? Well, they have the capacity to impose it, quite simply. Yeah.
Do you think the SDGs are? I mean, it's already, as you mentioned, aspirational. There is an oversight from the UN, but there's really no measurement.
The oversight
substantively.
is the
And
HLPF,
so
which is going on in July this year.
Each company has to sort of police itself in a way.
That's right.
So do you feel that this kind of fragmentation of the global economy after the pandemic, particularly, and this focus on supply chains and making sure we make stuff at home so that we're more resilient, less reliant on other countries, is that going to reduce the amount of leverage that multinational enterprises have in helping achieve the goals?
Well, there are many ways to answer your question. Fragmentation of the world accelerated, of course, deglobalization accelerated by the COVID crisis of 2020 and its subsequent implications. The UN SDGs implementation was going relatively well in 2019 by looking at the HLPF, which is an annual report. And also there is a tracking mechanism. The United Nations publishes an annual report, which you can look at. It's free of charge largely. And it tells you where different countries and sometimes different companies are located. What happened in 2020 and with the pandemic is that the implementation of the UN SDGs in developing countries, in countries in development, really suffered greatly. And there was a decrease in investment in projects which had the effect of really bringing in renewable energy, bringing in more green innovation and the like. So there was the literature indicates a decrease from 30 to 40% of SDG-related investment in developing countries in 2020, which didn't pick up. Oddly enough, certainly on the European side of the fence, there have been a lot of projects in these highly developed post-industrial countries which promote some of the UN SDGs. So you have this fragmentation in terms of the implementation of the UN SDGs. Also, you will hear that from a lot of developing countries. Look, we're going to be polluting because we want to industrialize. We want to diversify our economic base. You've done it in the 19th century. In post-industrial world. You have done it in the 20th century. Now you are innovative, innovation-driven, clean energy, more or less, because even the web is not that clean of an energy activity. But they're saying, we buy into the SDGs with the proviso that there should be exceptions for us.
Or ramp-ups.
Ramp-ups, exactly.
Yeah, definitely. Because and I think there's some merit to that argument. But if you take that we have a climate emergency, then it's not those provisos don't necessarily.
Of course, you will note that countries like Indonesia. I mean, if you look at Jakarta, which is a huge city, Indonesia is a country of, correct me if I'm wrong, I would say 220 million people.
Yeah, a little bit more.
The city of Jakarta is sinking literally. It's being, and they're already talking about moving it to a different location.
Yes, they are actually. They're building a new capital at
They are
this
building
point.
a new capital, slowly but surely. Let's hope it's not like Brasilia in Brazil, which hasn't really met with general approval by a lot of Brazilians.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, I think we have time for some questions. I don't know if we've had any in the chat yet, but if not, I'll continue to ask you a few, and then hopefully those of you who are participating online, please type your questions in the chat, and we'll relay those to John. I wanted to ask you, just has there been analysis done as to, the potential benefit from a bottom line perspective of adhering to the SDGs, right? I would imagine this goes back to our question on long-term perspective versus short-term, right? Because if you're participating in these, you're going to have to be investing in certain structures that may not pay off in the short run. I'm thinking clean energy, and particularly sometimes it's much more expensive to make the upfront investment, but then it ends up paying off longer term economically and environmentally. So have y'all addressed that topic?
It will be addressed at our New Delhi meeting.
Okay.
And I urge your listeners to get a copy of the Call for Papers.
Mm.
I'll give you a copy. No, actually, we have not, but actually, the literature indicates that not very many scholars have.
Mm.
A scholar by the name of Hans Kolk in Holland has attempted to do that in various publications.
Mm-hmm.
But you'll find that increasingly large multinational Fortune 500, from a U.S. perspective,
Mm-hmm.
companies mention the UN SDGs in their reports. The degree to which they implement them fully is an open question. You'd have to really do case studies with
Yeah.
the company. Now, to the question of would the ESG, and then additionally, if you look at it as an intermediate step leading to SDG implementation, would that be reflected in performance measures on the accounting front?
Mm.
Not much so far indicates that there have been identifiable empirical gains,
Mm-hmm.
but you would think that branding and reputation, particularly in issues of employment practices, diversity,
Mm-hmm.
and image, would be critical to a company, particularly companies in the field of consumer products.
Right.
One thinks of Coca-Cola, but there are many others.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you metrify that? How do you turn it into an accounting metrics? Now, you have to understand that the European Union has a more advanced form of social accounting in computations of its balance sheets or even income statements, in which it's built in most of the national accounting systems for corporations, and then that the EU itself has imposed further guidelines. You don't really find as much of that. There have been work done on trying to understand the impact, but it's really not conclusive.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be elusive on the answer and give us
Well, I
more
mean,
time.
yeah.
Hopefully, we can prove that it's a mutually beneficial thing. Now, you have to understand that the UN SDGs are scheduled to, I don't know about terminate, but the end point is 2030.
Mm.
So we are really theoretically 7 years. There is going to be a lot of work in multilateral institutions and national institutions as to what's next. Do we continue with the UN SDGs? Do we refine them? Do we adjust them? And do we do it within the context of the UN? Do we fragment it and leave it up to national authorities, which have really so far in the US at the national level, not done much. Now, if you look at U.S. cities and states, there's a lot that has been done, even in Atlanta, and it may or may not be directly related to the UN SDGs, but it has bearing on the UN SDGs. Certainly, the universities have bought in, and so that's the case of my university at Georgia Tech.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was wondering, do you have anything?
Yeah,
Got one question?
One of the questions, I think this kind of relates to what you're saying, but about education, higher institutions buying in. But the question was, what specifically can be done by multinational institutions and higher education to collaborate more to promote the SDGs so that graduates take those values with them into the professional arena?
Well, clearly there is in-house training. Clearly, corporations can finance the creation of research centers, which is the case already, or research chairs in the professoriate dedicated to those goals. And additionally, they can encourage students to have a more exposure in their undergrad or graduate studies to the broad concepts of the UN SDGs in their training. They can also make it part of their recruiting criterion. Do you just want students who master the basics, or do you want students who have a broader vision of the future and are ready to bring it in the corporation and make them welcome? At least these are some of the steps that could be taken.
Yeah. I'm interested.
They could be
too.
partnerships, of course. The creation of partnerships is one of the UN SDGs goal. creation of partnerships.
Mm.
Because I mean, the building of the achievement of the other goals is predicated on partnerships.
Mm.
So multinationals in and of themselves, cannot really be. They have to address various stakeholders beyond shareholders. Their consumers, their suppliers, but also the incoming flow of new graduates who are going to be tomorrow's generation of the futures or middle managers within a few short years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to ask a question related to that too, just about, I think we sort of addressed it, how the goals are affecting leadership, particularly at multinational enterprises, because I would imagine that with the war on talent, or war for talent, not war on talent, war for talent that we have, playing out in the private sector here, and coalescing with this idea of particularly Gen Z and the younger generation wanting to work for a company that has values or has a stance in the world, and we've seen all that play out in the U.S. With regard to racial equity, as you mentioned. It would seem that this would be, like you mentioned, fertile ground.
Yeah, it's fertile ground indeed. But you have to be very careful about there is a chasm between rhetoric and actual policy implementation.
Yeah.
So it's called sometimes it's called greenwashing.
Yes.
Sometimes it's called blue washing. But you can look it up. It's really the same thing.
Well, I think that's the root of a lot of the backlash. It's saying we want to do this, we just don't want someone telling us that we have to do it, right? And we don't want this to, like you said, be a Trojan horse for other ideals that may not align with my personal values or inputs on this.
If the national government were to be more involved, you could sort of provide incentives. They could be of a fiscal nature. And if you look at the legislations of the past year, the CHIPS Act, among others, there's a lot on green energy funding. Whether it survives the debt ceiling negotiations remains to be seen. But yes, governments can work in partnerships with multinational corporations by providing incentives, just as they can with universities and other actors in the community, non-governmental organizations, community groups, cities. Cities have always played a very important role in the United States in terms of, they picked up really when the Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Pact. A lot of the cities were leaders in the movement to the implementation of some of these ideas contained in the SDGs.
Yeah.
Atlanta really rose and shined in many aspects.
Yep, and green buildings and those kinds of things.
Green buildings, and we have a school of urban and regional planning at Georgia Tech, which does a lot in that area.
Great. Well, John, what would you hope somebody picks up the book? What would you hope they take away from it? I mean, how would you encourage someone, a civilian, not in the scholarly field, to think about this book and what they might glean from it?
Actually, one of the features of that book is that it's really less theory-driven, and the book really provides some very practical-oriented or practice-driven or best practices in terms of addressing grand challenges. Management and business administration and economics have not done a great job in addressing what is often called the grand challenges of society.
I'd imagine,
and so on. So that's an attempt, but this is not a book about IB theory and how it addresses or does not address the grand challenges contained in the UN SDGs. It's a book that contains a lot of cases embedded in some of the selected chapters.
Great. We got one more question, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a good one to end on.
Yes.
But the question is, in your opinion, which large corporation in Georgia is implementing UN SDGs well? I don't know if you're...
Yeah, and the big brag for the state of Georgia is that we have the third largest concentration of Fortune 500 companies in the United States. And so,
it's really hard. There are rankings on sustainability. I don't know if you're familiar with Conway and Site Selection, the magazine Site Selection. It's a unique magazine, and it's a unique consulting corporation created by a Georgia Tech grad in the late 1940s rather, Mac Conway, and the company still exists, and they produce, and they are in the process of producing a ranking, sustainability ranking of states, local communities, and it should come out in the next month or so. So I urge you, I look at it regularly to look at site selection in terms of identifying who are the best performers in that,
Yeah.
rather than directly answer your question.
Well, I think that's very interesting because what we're writing about a lot these days is the electric vehicle sector and the interplay between that and renewable energies. I just wrote a story this past week about a company that's building a plant down in South Georgia to do synthetic
Yes.
graphite production.
Yes.
And one of the biggest parts of their decision-making process was that they knew they were going to have access to clean energy
Yes.
through the solar farms that are being built down there, as well as the new nuclear facility. So
So
that the goals that they had for their investors and the projection that they want to put out in society
yeah.
played into how Georgia was considered as a
Indeed.
location.
And Georgia has been very successful in attracting companies, particularly from South Korea more recently in the
yeah.
past 4 or 5 years.
Yes.
You have the plant near Savannah.
Yeah.
You have other plants nearby in various counties. And that's quite a successful performance. And many of these companies consider the issue of clean energy, clean sourcing, paramount
Right.
in the matrix that they use to decide on locational investment.
Yep.
So plus for Georgia in that regard.
Yeah, and we'll be looking at the Conway rankings and site selection. Of course, site selection is the one that's given Georgia the best state in the country to do business for something like 8 years. So they're based in
Well,
Norcross. I mean,
Yeah. No, but I mean, they not always. Georgia does not always come out at the
Yeah.
top.
Anyway.
But that's business climate issues.
Yes, and we'll be watching all that, and of
Yeah.
course we'll be covering the international investment that's coming to the state. But thank you so much,
should.
John.
Yeah.
Really appreciate you doing
my
this.
pleasure.
And we'll be linking to cyber and any other resources that you want to send to our readership. So
Yeah.
thank you again.